Thank you so much for joining us on the program. I am Folashade Ogrinde. In what can be described as the largest piece of investigative journalistic work, a coalition of media outlets led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in Washington, D.C. has revealed incriminating evidence exposing some of the world's richest and famous. The Pandora Papers exposes how some of the most powerful people in the world, including more than 330 politicians from 90 countries, use secret offshore companies to hide their wealth. According to Premium Times, a number of high-profile persons in Nigeria have been named in the Pandora Papers scandal, as 137 Nigerians are said to have acquired 233 UK properties worth over £170 million. Now, while the legality of foreign shell accounts is often blurred, the obvious effect it has on any local economy, especially for a struggling one like Nigeria, cannot be overlooked. Now, today on the program, we shall take a look at the Pandora Papers, capital flights, and the slippery slope of tax invasion. Now, to deliberate more on this, I'm joined now by Mr. Taiwo Yedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Now, I would like you to clarify on something I think a lot of people would want clarity on. Now, is it legal to use a tax haven or own shell accounts abroad?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a straight yes or no answer. It's a mixture of that because it depends on what you're using it for. So offshore locations, of course, you would imagine that the countries that set up these locations want to attract funds, obviously for their own development, but most times you may find that the funds they are attracting are to the detriment of the other countries where those funds are coming from. So there are clearly people who are there for legitimate reasons. So to those people, I would say yes, it's legal to use those structures. And of course, there are people who are there for illegitimate reasons. For example, if you think about many of the entertainers, if you think about some of the high-profile investors, it's possible to be there because you want to avoid paying double taxation. So you pay taxes, for example, in Nigeria on your investment, and then you receive your dividend, and you want to put it in a location, want to preserve the value of your investment so that you don't lose value due to the devaluation of the naira. So you want to take that amount in foreign currency to a location where you are not asked to pay tax again on the dividend on which you've paid taxes before. For those kind of arrangements, including those who want to have ease of succession planning, should they pass on, and those who want confidentiality for reasons that they are afraid of, maybe kidnappers and other stuff. So you could say those are legitimate reasons. But then there are people who are there, especially politicians, because they have illicit financial flows and proceeds of crime that they do not want their governments and their people to be aware of. So they're essentially stealing money and they're hiding them away. So those are clearly examples of illegal reasons why some people are at those locations around the world.
Now, how easy really is it to hide money offshore?
I've said before now, this is many years ago, it was very easy. So people were hiding money for decades. Of course, we still remember the case of Sani Abacha, a former military ruler in Nigeria, who hid billions of dollars abroad, and we didn't know until he passed on. And up to today, over 20 years after passing on, we haven't fully recovered all of these monies. So there were locations where this was their bread and butter. They just guarantee you 100% secrecy, and then you can hide anything there for as long as you want. But it's becoming more difficult now around the world to hide anything. I think it's even stupid for anyone to think that they can hide something now forever. Because we have common reporting standard where the world has come together to say we cannot continue to provide secrecy, and opacity around financial flows and people's wealth. We just need to know what you have. If you have nothing to hide, then why are you hiding? So the world is now beginning to exchange information about the wealth of people. And also, there's more pressure on these kind of tax havens and secret locations to review their rules. So it is no longer a thing that can be done now in a sustainable manner to try and hide what you're doing. It's not a question of whether you'll be found out, it's just a question of when.
About capital flight. To what extent do you think these hidden offshore accounts or shell companies affect Nigeria's economy?
Unfortunately, these kind of issues tend to affect developing countries more than the developed countries for many reasons. One of which is that developing countries tend not to have good institutions, robust processes, and structures in place. And then the abuse of power, especially by politicians, seems to be quite rampant. So you find that either people are padding, contracts, inflated budget is being padded, or people just outrightly steal government money for their own personal use. So these locations provide the easy avenue for those kind of money to be kept. So, and to that extent, you find that the impact on developing countries, including Nigeria, can be quite significant. And from the Pandora Papers, we have seen that even though about 91 countries are affected, it seems to be disproportionately more of developing countries being affected by these practices. And therefore, to that extent, I would say the impact is significant. It has always been. We've had different reports about illicit financial flows affecting Africa. And many of those reports would always conclude that the biggest impact, even within the African continent, is indeed in Nigeria.
Now, some countries have advocated the ban on shell companies and secret accounts. For Nigeria, what do you think can be done? And do you think, as a tax expert, do we have certain laws that regulate issues like this?
Yeah, so I think maybe the political will hasn't been there. So this is not the first time we've seen, the Panama Papers, we've seen the Paradise Papers, Pandora's Papers. So you can go on and on. And it tends to be only sensational for a couple of weeks, and then the world will move on to the next story to unfold. And also because you find that whenever these revelations are made, they're really very high profile people, many of them very high up in government. So essentially, we're asking people who are perpetrating this to also be the ones to change the rules. So that's a little bit difficult. So there has to be, first and foremost, I think, very objective understanding and analysis of the issues by the general population, including the media, including civil society groups, so people understand and not paint everybody with the same brush. Once your name is mentioned, there are indeed people who are there for legitimate reasons. I would admit that maybe more people are there for reasons that are not legitimate. But having said that, I think Nigeria has to even demonstrate the willingness to act. And I think that Pandora Papers is probably just a tiny fraction of what we're having to deal with in the country here in Nigeria. So we have people who are not even, so they just out of audacity, sheer audacity, and they're stealing money, and the money is in Nigeria. The money is in banks. They have the money is in properties in Lagos, in Abuja, so if we really want to tackle these issues, we have a million and one sources of information to be able to do that. And I do not think that trying to ban, shell companies will be, the way out. What I think will be the way out is to try and take it more seriously. Issues around transparency and disclosure. Even if you have a shell company, I want to know who is ultimately behind the shell company. Just disclose. Let's have beneficial ownership register. Let's have an explained wealth order where people can be held to account for resources that they own, whether those sources are legitimate or not, but you need to explain to us so everybody is aware of those sources. If they are criminal in nature, then you should face the consequences. If it's to do with tax evasion, then you also need to face the consequences. And of course, after we've collected our taxes, you then go and answer for your crime as a separate matter. So Once we demonstrate this willingness, especially from the political class, to tackle the problems, then we start making progress towards the destination that we want.
Now, Mr. Oyedele, you made a very valid point about political will to stem corruption and all sorts of malpractices. But we'll take a break here, and when we return, we'll discuss more on tax evasion and some of Nigeria's tax policies. Do stay with us.
Corruption not in my country.
Hello? Yeah, I found your wallet in front of a supermarket. Meet me at Apple Junction. Yes, I'll be waiting for you.
Now we find out. Two of us.
Thank you very much, officer. You know, it's surprising that men like you still exist in the police force.
Yes, so...
Oh, yes.
This is just a token of my appreciation.
Oh, no, you don't need to do this. We are only doing our job.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
You're welcome.
Now I know police is really my friend.
Yes.
Friend. Hey. Okay, which came up with this one? I don't understand.
You know your problem. You are greedy. I'm a policeman who is doing his job. All forms of corruption in the force. Not in my country.
Corruption not in my country.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I've been discussing the Pandora Papers, capital flights and its effects on Nigeria's economy. And Mr. Taiwo Oyedele, the fiscal policy partner and Africa tax leader at PwC, has been my guest. Well, thank you so much for standing by, sir. Now, let's turn our attention now to tax policy in Nigeria, one of which is the issue of multiple taxation. What do you think should be done, especially when one takes into consideration how it affects businesses, especially small, medium-scale businesses in Nigeria?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think before I get into multiple taxation and the impact on society and maybe the economy, so I'd like to speak a little bit more around tax policy, even to do with evasion and aggressive avoidance. So Nigeria has introduced two different schemes. So at about 2017, 2018, we had the VAT, that's the Voluntary Asset and Income Declaration Scheme. And then thereafter, we have VOAS, which is Voluntary Offshore Asset Regularization Scheme, where people were invited to disclose whatever they had, either within the country or outside the country, on which taxes should have been paid for, which they haven't been paid. And it was very surprising for me that the response was quite disappointing, but maybe also not very surprising, because you also find that government at the highest level did not seem to show very keen and genuine interest in trying to fish out people who are evading taxes, including those who get rich at the expense of the country. So both the VAT scheme and the VOAS haven't been as successful as it could have been. One thing that we could have done differently, which is still open today, is for the country to use data and intelligence. So if you keen within the global system and also locally to use information and intelligence, when people have money, regardless of where they get the money from, they tend to do three things. They tend to spend, they tend to save, and they tend to invest. If you begin to track investment, savings, and spending, especially using technology, then it's difficult for people to then hide. When you buy a vehicle, you register it with the state. Government will register your vehicle. You want to travel abroad, you have a passport, you buy FX, and then you buy a ticket. If you buy land, the country is aware, the state government is aware of it. You are sending money to put your kids in school abroad. Every other thing that you do actually is within the purview of government, only that they are not connecting the dots. We need to start connecting the dots so that we get people to pay their fair share of taxes to the system, and then hold government to account as to how the money is being spent. So that way we can control over borrowing and this rising cost of servicing debt to revenue ratio that is becoming unsustainable. And that leads to your second question around multiple taxation and the impact on the economy. So unfortunately, Nigeria is one of those countries where people pay a lot of taxes, but government gets very little, which is like an irony. it's a contradiction because people pay so much, but government gets so little. And the reason is what happens in between. And that's a lot of leakages, a lot of extortion, a lot of corruption. That's the reason why people pay a lot and government gets so little. And this happens simply because of multiple taxation. If we keep introducing different taxes collected by state actors, non-state actors, especially small businesses are disproportionately affected, it's almost impossible for the country to grow in that way. Interestingly, of all the taxes we have in Nigeria, formal and informal, legitimate and illegitimate, over 100, only about 8 taxes, 8, less than 10, give us about 98% of government revenue in Nigeria. So in other words, we can easily repeal about 90 plus taxes today, and the impact on government will be less than 2%. And then people will be able to do their businesses will grow. And by growing, they can pay more taxes, employ more people who will consume and pay VAT, who will earn personal income and pay personal income tax, and the list just goes on and on. So in more ways than one, it is a sensible economic policy to try and harmonize taxes, reduce the number of taxes, automate the way we collect taxes so that we're not using touts to collect money in cash who end up in private pockets. Once you do this, you begin to see the improvement in the tax system. It's been done in places like Kaduna State. Kaduna State was able to increase their revenue by more than 300% in just a space of 5 years without introducing any new taxes, but in fact, harmonizing, reducing existing taxes, and then automating how they're collected.
I was just about to ask because you mentioned something quite interesting. You said, government should, in a sort of way, reduce taxation. But President Buhari, while he was presenting the 2022 budget at the joint session of the National Assembly today, said that Nigeria would improve revenue by taxing Nigerians more. What do you make of this, please?
No, I think, it will be counterproductive to try and tax Nigerians more. So this is not the time to tax people more. The economic recovery is still very slow and fragile. And what you find is that the percentage of businesses and individuals who are tax compliant is very small. So whenever you increase their tax rate, you make them even more competitive because there is a lot of people who are not compliant and they gain the advantage by not paying their own taxes. So this is not the time to raise taxes. This is not the time to introduce new ones. It is rather the time to try and increase the efficiency of tax collection. It is the time to improve the efficiency of utilization and prioritization of expenses. For example, I do not see why we have to borrow about $1.5 billion to try and, fix our refineries that we haven't been able to fix in more than a decade. And doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon because it's just the way the public sector is set up in Nigeria, where decisions are not made on what is commercial, but what is politically expedient. So what we should be looking at is how do we expand the tax base, get everybody who has the means to pay but has not been paying, including people who stash money away abroad in the places like we've seen from the Pandora Papers, including people who are here in Nigeria with properties and assets of different kinds, but you can't find their names in the tax register. Including people who have companies that are not tax compliant. And those taxes range from value-added tax to companies' income tax, and even more so personal income tax and property taxes. So what we need to do is to expand the tax net, expand the tax base, and increase the efficiency of collection. But I will strongly advise against introducing new taxes or raising the rate of existing taxes at this time. It will be counterproductive.
Now let's talk about non-remittance of tax refunds and how Nigerians perceive the way government utilize this tax. So how do you react to this and what do you think can be done in the long run? Because if the government intends to tax Nigerians more and they feel that these monies are not being used the way they ought to be, then I think there might be a problem. What do you think?
Yes, the tax morale of Nigerians is very low, in fact, one of the lowest in the world. So I was asked to participate, in an initiative by the Nigerian Economy Summit Group about 2, 3 years ago, which was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we conducted a national study to try and find out the tax morale of Nigerians, and it was, maybe not surprisingly low, but it was even lower than what I had expected, such that almost over 70% of Nigerians see nothing wrong with evading their taxes. I think actually about 83% of Nigerians believe that it's okay to not pay their taxes. And their number one reason for that is they do not trust government. Number two reason is they do not see the fiscal exchange. What do you get for the taxes you pay? They believe that government is corrupt, and whatever taxes they pay to government will be stolen. And I think Nigerians are justified to think like that, because every time you hear in the news billions and billions of money, that including not even naira alone, even dollars, that have been stolen. You hear cases like the NDDC, and it's very depressing for you to want to continue to pay your taxes. The only way government can fix this is to try and be transparent. So be very transparent and accountable with the revenue that you make, whether it's from tax or whether it's from national resources. And then more importantly, how this money are being spent. You need to let us know if you are building road. What's the quality of the road you are building? If you spend 10 billion, could you have spent the 10 billion to build 3 of those roads, or is it just one? Once you see that transparency, and you see our leaders leading by example by paying their own taxes and living like we're in a crisis, not living as if it's Christmas and there's money all over the place. So when they set these examples, then Nigerians will begin to think about paying their taxes voluntarily.
All right, let's talk about some of the highlights of the 2022 budget. President Buhari submitted a certain budget of, I think, over 16 trillion naira. And, the oil price benchmark was placed at $57 per barrel at a cost of 410 naira. So what do you think of some of these parameters on the 2022 budget?
Yeah, I think the parameters make sense. At least it's good to be prudent. If you put the benchmark for crude oil at 57, it's currently around close to $80 per barrel. But it's a very volatile commodity. So I think 57 makes sense. The exchange rate at 410 doesn't look realistic to me, but historically, government has always used whatever exchange rate the CBN wanted for their budget, regardless of what the outlook is for the naira exchange rate against the US dollars. So, and I think fundamentally, some of the issues there is the fact that in terms of our production of crude oil, we have challenges with production. Even though we have the OPEC quota, we are not even able to produce up to the level of the quota that has been assigned to us. So as you see the price of crude oil go up in the international market, we are unable to maximize the benefit from that because our production is below our quota at the moment. And in addition to that, because of the very huge leakage that we're getting from fuel subsidy, we are beginning to even spend more to import refined product than we are making from exporting crude petroleum, crude oil. I read an OPEC report recently that says that Nigeria is beginning now to import more in terms of refined product than we are exporting in crude, which means it's a negative balance of payment if you just look at the petroleum sector alone. And this is a sector that is supposed to be a blessing to us as a country, and it's suddenly becoming a source of concern and a cost in a way for the country. So while the benchmarks are reasonable, I think what's even more important is how we implement the budget. And I see some of the provisions in the budget are to do with the impact of the Petroleum Industry Act, which was very surprising to me because government has just increased the cost or the expense in the budget, and then they reduced the expected revenue, and then they blamed this largely on the PIA, whereas the PIA was supposed to do the direct opposite of reducing our costs and increasing our revenue. And then you find also that for many government agencies that we call MDAs, so many of them have been asked to go and generate revenue. And I worry that this is going to fall again on the business community and SMEs. When you ask MDAs to go and generate revenue, they're going to do all sorts of things. And that's, and for some of them, for every 1 naira they generate, there's 3 naira that has gone into the pockets of the individual officers. So all of this being extorted from the public, especially the business community. What I think is right is to ask government agencies to focus on providing services and facilitating growth and businesses. The role of generating revenue should be left to the tax authority, the FRS, and maybe the customs service, while everybody else should provide services to facilitate economic growth. What we are seeing today around overregulation, around bureaucracy and red tape is also a nightmare for people who want to do business. It is so difficult in Nigeria to do almost anything. And God help you want to either import or export. It's even more complicated. So these are the areas where government needs to focus and then to prioritize their spending so they don't have to spend the little money they have borrowing to fix infrastructure when they can easily provide the right environment with the right policy, and the private sector will build those infrastructure. Whether you're talking about ports, whether you're talking about refineries, whether you're talking about roads, many of them are commercially viable. Private sector will do it better and will even pay taxes to government. We should move away from this old school idea of government wanting to do everything, even when they do not have the financial means and the capacity to do it.
Quickly, I would like to get your reaction on this. A total of 6.26 trillion naira was placed as Nigeria's deficit for the year 2022, and debt servicing would account for 3.61 trillion naira. What do you make of this, especially when you take a look at the fact that Nigeria has a certain threshold of 3%, and right now we've overshot that by 39%. So the total GDP estimation is at 3.39%. What do you make of this?
Yes, so we have the Fiscal Responsibility Act that says our deficit should not be more than 3% of GDP. But what has happened most recently is that government will just go and amend the law so that they can either, exceed that threshold, or the law itself has a caveat that says, except in the case of, maybe you have a crisis, maybe you have a pandemic like COVID-19, and then you can exceed it. So on that basis, government has, used that as the opportunity to exceed the threshold. But I think fundamentally, what's even more important is that even though our debt to GDP ratio continues to be below international benchmark, I think it's still under 30%. But the fact that our debt service costs as a ratio of revenue is already over 70%, it means that we don't need any prophet or scientists or fisheries to tell us that this is becoming unsustainable. You cannot get to a point where all your revenue you are using to service debt. What would then happen is you have to borrow to meet both your recurrent expenditure, including payment of salaries, and then for capital expenditure. The moment you start borrowing to meet salary payment, that cannot repay itself because it's recurring. Then you get into this debt trap where you have no option but to keep borrowing, and you get to a point your borrowing costs will be even higher because the lenders will be, concerned that you cannot pay back as at when due. And then you get to a point where you have to just maybe keep on printing naira. And God forbid, we get to a point where Zimbabwe was some few years back, where the money becomes completely useless. So we have to reverse this trend so we don't make a bad situation even worse. And the way to do that is to try and prioritize our expenses, to gain efficiency in what we spend money on, and then to try and expand the tax base as well as the tax nets so that you are raising your revenue faster than you are raising your, your debt and your borrowing.
Well, your daily fiscal policy partner and the Africa tax leader at PwC, thank you so much for your contribution on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
This much we can take on the program. Thank you so much for watching. I am Fola Shadi Ogurinde. Bye for now.